violent crimes, and most of the time their only protection is a badge. As News 12 New Jersey's Laura Jones tells us, probation officers say they've had enough.
I've been attacked on a couple of occasions and had people threatened.
Greg Martin's been on the job for 20 years. He and other probation officers say when they're out on the streets and in back alleys, they need protection. They need guns. Right now, the most they can carry is pepper spray, and that's only with a judge's permission.
It's not just about guns, it's about enforcement status, having the power to do something.
There is legislation pending that would allow probation officers to carry guns, but it's been shot down by lawmakers in the past.
The administrative office of the courts probably won't go for the idea. That's because probation officers work for the courts, and they're supposed to focus more on rehabilitation, not law enforcement.
Don't tell that to the people who have to face convicted criminals every day, often in high-crime areas.
For probation to be effective, you have to be intrusive. You have to go out into the street. You have to go where people live.
When we go out in the field, we need to have the protection. This is one way of protecting ourselves, protecting the public.
Federal probation officers are allowed to carry guns, and in New York and Pennsylvania, probation officers are armed as well. There haven't been any probation officers killed on the job, and few hurt seriously. But the officers we spoke to say they want more protection before someone is. In Trenton, Laura Jones, News 12, New Jersey.
The Justice Department says almost half the prisoners in state prisons
supposed to be watching, and it's resulting in more crime. Our Capitol Bureau correspondent Laura Jones is in Trenton, where the officers staged a protest. Laura, can you tell us what their concerns are?
The men and women I talk to say they want to do their jobs. The problem is there aren't enough good guys to watch over the lawbreakers, and without more funding, parole officers are afraid things will only get worse.
I have had individuals that have murdered while on probation.
I had 50 people that were convicted of sex offenses. 3 or 4 of them have reoffended and with the same victim.
Those stories were echoed across the state. Probation officers in all 21 counties picketed in front of local courthouses to say public safety may be in danger. Their claim, there isn't enough money to hire a sufficient number of people.
The majority of my day is sitting behind a desk, dealing with mounds of paperwork.
Because the courts are also overwhelmed, a lot of cases are plea bargained. The offenders get probation instead of jail, meaning more criminals to deal with who are more violent. But it's the probation officers who feel imprisoned.
Well, we're unarmed. I have a can of mace when I go out in the field.
The administrative office of the court oversees these probation officers, and it agrees with what they're trying to say. The problem is the AOC has other departments they're dealing with that need funding just as much.
We certainly don't disagree with them on the matter of staffing, and it will probably have to be dealt with in the context of other needs for the court systems, including family courts, where we also have concerns about appropriations levels.
During budget hearings, the Office of the Courts did bring up the issue of staffing to lawmakers. The state set aside $64 million for probation, but the officers say that's simply not enough.
Hey, Laura, you mentioned heavy caseloads. Do you have any specifics?
I do. The state says the average probation officer will have about 157 cases. However, the officer we talked to, Stephanie, she says right now she has over 220 cases she's supposed to keep close tabs on.
Okay, Laura Jones, thanks for that report.
Well, this is a big night for the...
I'm Janine Strafasi. Eddie Warner's mother speaks out.
And I'm Donald.
The mother of a...
In Toms River today, you may have noticed a picket line. Probation officers in the county and statewide are saying too few probation officers, too many criminals.
Well, first we need more probation officers hired throughout the state so that we can closely monitor our criminals, because we're getting more dangerous criminals being placed on probation. Without the additional staff of probation officers being hired, we just cannot effectively do our job, and society is put at risk. Caseloads today are at staggering levels. Probation officers don't have the resources, nor do they have the tools to properly supervise their offenders. Many of them are absconding from supervision because we don't have enough supervising officers on hand. Many of these offenders go undetected, and we cannot get to them.
Many of the passing motorists sounded their horns in support of the picketers. The Probation Association of New Jersey says 350 to 400 more officers need to be hired to effectively supervise adult and juvenile offenders.
Investigators from the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office raided the Asbury Park Police Department, seizing employment records.
The ad promises the opportunity to choose a new union. The New Jersey Public Employees Association is hoping to replace the CWA, AFSCME, and other unions now representing state workers. Rich Young followed the founder of the group known as New Jersey PEA. County courthouses across the state today, part of an effort to raise public awareness to problems they say exist in the system. The Probation Association contends officers are overworked, and that puts the community at large at risk. The group says New Jersey is short 350 to 400 officers. The officers also say transferring the collection of child support payments from the responsibility of the Probation Department to other state agencies will result in lost money for women. Coming up on NJ.
Was made possible by grants from, in partnership with public television, serving to inform, enlighten, and educate the citizens of New Jersey. From NJN, the New Jersey Channel, the Emmy Award-winning NJN News with Kent Manahan, Dick Forney with business, and Jerry Henry with sports.
Good evening. There's a move tonight to give more than 1,000 New Jersey probation officers the right to carry a gun. Currently, those who work directly with convicted criminals on probation are forbidden to carry weapons. Officers want that changed. Rich Young reports.
John Smack says he puts his life on the line almost daily. As a probation officer in Monmouth County, his job often takes him to dangerous areas to confront potentially dangerous people. All this while having no way to protect himself.
There are a lot of great people that live around here, but, you know, along with that, there are a lot of people that they're even scared of. The people, like I said, the gang members, people openly around the street making sales, buying drugs. So when you have that kind of situation, you just never know what you're going to come across.
So Smack is joining 1,500 POs statewide who support a bill that would give them the right to carry guns. The officers deal with 150,000 people on probation, including convicted rapists, thieves, even murderers. Assemblyman Frank Blee is sponsoring a measure to arm POs to protect themselves and the public.
I believe they are in jeopardy. Many times they're working with criminals who, if they violated probation, they know their next stop is jail, so they're in a very desperate situation.
Probation officers work for the administrative office of the courts. Rather than law enforcers, the court considers them as an arm of the court that's supposed to be impartial. In a statement, a court spokesman said the functions of police and probation are not only different, but incompatible. The head of the officers' union disagrees.
That judges sentence people to probation terms, and they should expect that the probation officers that work for them, that supervise these criminals, should have the power to make an arrest and get that person off the street if they're committing a new offense.
There was a similar measure proposed in the last legislative session. It got out of committee but was never posted for a vote. Now the officers are again trying to send a message that their jobs are still dangerous, and giving them law enforcement authority would be safer for both them and the general public. Rich Young, NJN News, Asbury Park.
Hello and welcome to New Jersey Legislative Update. New Jersey probation officers currently supervise over 100,000 probationers. But if one of those offenders physically threatens a probation officer, the only weapon he has to protect himself is pepper spray in some instances. Probation officers want to change that. They want them to carry guns. 30th District Senator Robert Singer has sponsored a bill which would give probation officers the same privileges as parole officers and police officers. Senator Singer and Stuart Martinson of the Probation Association of New Jersey are joining us now to talk more about the topic. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
I guess, first of all, to set this up, if you would, Senator Singer, I know that you had authorized some legislation at the last legislature, which I'm sure expired now. You plan to reintroduce that again?
Absolutely. It will be reintroduced this week. Unfortunately, we failed to get it through both houses and on the governor's desk signed, but we're confident that we'll be able to do it this time.
Now, if you would outline that legislation for us and tell us what kind of rights it does give the probation officers that they're looking for.
Basically, it's going to give probation officers the full rights of police action. This allows them to carry a gun and to arrest someone if they're process of seeing a crime, sounds like that. In essence, I think it puts an additional 1,500 to 2,000 police-type people on the street. And second of all, as we've been dealing with and discussing, is probation is no longer dealing with minor offenses. These are serious offenders in many cases. Many of them, unfortunately, have carried weapons in the past and might carry them in the future, and you're having a probation officer totally unarmed, dealing with, in some cases, repeat offenders, and not having at least the protection to know that they can protect themselves or anyone else around them.
Now, Senator Singer, how did it first come to your attention? Who approached you with this?
We've been discussing, as you know, we're taking a look at both probation and parole in general and how we can change what is happening. The probation officers were very concerned because, again, as I said, the type of criminal they're dealing with. And they felt that they could do a lot more, both for themselves and for the state as a whole, to be able to have police powers and be able to have a gun with them in necessary and tough areas. And I think it's very important. And as I said before, it puts an additional 1,500 to 2,000 police people on the streets protecting the citizens of our state. Very positive thing, very good thing. And again, we're not talking about untrained people. We're not talking about people who haven't gone through the same training that a police officer goes for, who is dealing with the criminal element, should be able to protect themselves and protect those around him.
Added protection that I'm sure, Stuart, you can tell us about firsthand knowledge, since you do work for the Ocean County Probation Office as well as your firsthand knowledge in the state. Can you give us a little insight, if you would, please, on your firsthand knowledge and why it is so necessary that you have guns when you, for example, go into a drug violator's home?
Sure. I've been a probation officer for 10 years, and most of that time I've spent in adult supervision. And I know for a fact that I've had some very bad areas that I've had to go into while as a probation officer, and I've had to be intrusive. And when you're intrusive into these people's lives, many of our probationers are not simply one-time offenders, as the Senator was saying. They're getting more violent. We have offenders on probation who have committed murder in the past. They've committed serious sexual assaults, robberies. In many cases, we get probationers who have committed more serious crimes, but the crimes are downgraded to less serious ones. So we're at the point now where when we do go out into the field, or even in the office, we have probationers coming in, we're dealing with them, we're interacting with them. We know that in some cases they may be armed even. We're concerned about that. They're a threat to us in the office, in the field. And this is a major problem for us all over the state, not just in Ocean County, although statistically there are over 100,000 adult probationers in New Jersey alone, and I believe that accounts to 2,000 per 100,000 residents. And that's not including your juvenile population, which I believe is around 20 or 30,000. And your domestic violence offenders and sex offenders as well.
Per residence. Now, what would that ratio be of probation officers with their caseload, for example, per their probationers?
Approximately, I think there are 1,500 to 1,600 probation officers now in the Judiciary in the state of New Jersey. In Ocean County, it's probably more like 83 or 85, but not all of them are doing supervision work. The emphasis has been taken away from the supervision of adults and juveniles by the judiciary, and more emphasis has been placed on other areas of judicial functions.
By the way, I think it's part of a problem, too. There's no question about it in the revamping of the penal system of our state. We need more probation officers, more parole officers, more supervision, less caseload per probation officer to do the kind of job we want to see. We're not happy with what is happening, certainly in the penal system within our state. We have more prisons today we had in 1980. No one feels safer than they did in 1980. And the fact is we can't continue to build more and more prisons and not have the backup services of both probation and parole officers there to supervise the person once they come out. I know we've also seen they're going to do a major overhaul. Assemblyman Hofstapel is heading that, of the parole system itself, and take a look at what we're doing at. But when someone comes out on parole or probation, we have to make sure that there's backup there to supervise them, make sure they have a job, make sure they have a place to live, and make sure they are doing the right things and not see the repeat offender situation that is happening 2 and 3 and 4 times within the system.
That's a good point you mentioned. And with the Parole Commission, the media obviously has seen recently that the state and the governor and our legislators are acknowledging there is a problem and our parole system does need to be revamped. I'd like to talk about the particulars on those things in a moment, but first we're going to take a short break. So stay with us. We'll be right back here at New Jersey Legislative Update. Hi, welcome back to New Jersey Legislative Update, and we're talking about probation officers and the issue of whether or not they should carry guns and have the same power that police officers do in the state of New Jersey here. Senator Singer, when we left it before the break, we were talking about some of the things we've seen in the media lately, and I myself, as a matter of fact, went to the Parole Commission hearing headed by Assemblyman Holzapfel. Things in the news recently, like the Mudman-Simon case and the Collins case, they've certainly illustrated the need for revamping here in our parole system. Would you not agree?
Absolutely. It's brought to our attention the frightening things that are happening out there. First of all, there's a lot of problems with parolees and having used drugs in prison. There is no program for them in many prisons for rehabilitation. They come back out being drug addicts again. I mean, those kind of things have to be stopped. There has to be certain mandates to see that people coming out of prison, not only the fact they're clean when they're in there and clean when they come out, that they stay clean from those type of situations. Because, again, they become the repeat offenders. We've got to make sure they have jobs, they have decent places to live, and they are supervised where they're at. Probation officers, parole officers have to be to do that. With the caseloads they have, they can't do that. They can't thoroughly check on that person. You know something? There's nothing better than the probation officer or the parole officer physically there making sure that person's going to work every day, where that person's living, and the fact is they're not breaking their probation or parole. If that doesn't happen, you get the recidivism of repeat offenders time and time again. They want to put a stop to it. Person doing that can't go out there unarmed. A person doing that can't do it thoroughly without police powers. And more important, you need more of them. So I think there's some aspects we have to look at, and I think that's one part that we're going to look at, both parole and probation officers, beefing them up, getting more of them out there, and really changing around what is happening in the penal system within the state.
Stuart, I'm aware of the fact that way back in 1974, I think it was, probation officers did have the right to carry a firearm back then. Then they lost it. Why was that, and why was all that changed then?
Yes, I think it was a philosophy at that time in the 70s, which was a social work one. And apparently many of the hierarchy now that exists in the administrative office of the courts continues to believe in a social work philosophy, which is obviously not working, as the Senator has indicated, with parolees and now, of course, with the probationers as well. These are more violent offenders we're dealing with. Social work is not working, although it's still a component of what we should be doing, but there must be more of an emphasis on surveillance, on search and seizure, and on other measures such as those in order to ensure public safety.
Obviously, there have been some societal changes from the things that you're just mentioning, and here in the 90s, some of the things you've just mentioned are real cold, hard facts, I guess we should say. If you could just kind of tell us, if you could, what is the greatest risk that a probation officer faces on a daily basis? Give us some kind of idea, if you could.
I think that the greatest risk is confrontation, especially in the areas of the supervision areas, juveniles and adults. The probation officer is, as a necessity, the role is to confront the probationer, whether it be a juvenile or an adult, and get them to obey the law, get them to obey the court's order. And in many cases, essentially, that means to enforce the law almost, to interact with the police to ensure the public safety. And I think that confrontation aspect is the main reason why we need to be given full law enforcement powers under the Senator's.
By the way, that goes really to the heart of what we're talking about. If he had a confrontation, he'd have to call a local police person to come there and arrest that person.
Oh, is that right?
He can't arrest that person per se.
That's correct.
And that's really key to it. I mean, they know that. The person on probation knows that, and knows that they don't have that police power. It's ridiculous. But even going further into it, you know, we're seeing that we've passed legislation that talk about 3 times and in. You know, I mean, you know, the three strike type of concepts. There are 2 areas we have to put our money into. We've got to look at the first-time offender, the youthful offender, and making sure they don't become a repeat offender, and working on that, and doing all the programs with the DARE program that works so well, and all these other things like that, getting kids away from drugs, understanding that. And then we've got to take a look at the repeat offender and make sure they're monitored safely so we don't have the kind of problems that have happened in the past. I think this is just one step in the right direction. And being fearful for a person who's probation, not knowing that the person that's monitored him doesn't have a gun, doesn't have police power, is a negative, not a positive. I don't know why the courts are afraid of this. I don't believe that their job is a total social work job today. It's a police type of job with social work in that. They've always had excellent records of doing fine jobs. I think they're asking for something that makes sense. And again, it protects the public, protects themselves, and in general, I think sends a stronger message to people on probation.
public safety seems to be the key issue here. We're talking about Stewart perhaps being, not only Stewart being protected by having a gun, but when you're saying he takes that moment to go make that phone call, what could that probationer do in the meantime, which we've both seen this past year? So.
Well, again, it's knowing that he doesn't have those powers, and they know it.
They do.
We think that people on probation or parole don't know the law wrong. They know it better than we do.
Yeah, do you think they actually take advantage then?
Absolutely. They know where they can push them. They know how to push their button, and they know you can't do anything about it. You have to go find a police person. I mean, it becomes ridiculous. This is, a person is on probation. They should be monitored by a person who has the skills that a probation officer has, but should also have the authority of a police person in that.
You mentioned the state Supreme Court. We should probably enlighten our viewers that the state Supreme Court ruled against the probation officers joining the union. I don't know, bring us up to speed on that lawsuit, Stuart, if you would, where that stands right now.
Currently, we have a lawsuit against the administrative office of the courts and the Supreme Court, which has barred us from being affiliated with the Police Benevolent Association. Probation officers have been barred from either being members of the PBA or, for that matter, the Fraternal Order of Police. And we feel that PANJ, the Probation Association of New Jersey, under the president, Mr. George Christie, feels that probation officers should have that right, that it's a right of the Constitution to join a union of your choice, and essentially the Police Benevolent Association has been extremely supportive of our efforts, and the Third District Court in Philadelphia hopefully will make that decision sometime
So the
this year.
PBA is in favor of this?
That's
they
correct.
would like
Absolutely. The police organizations are in favor of this. They realize the benefit for it. They understand the danger they're under. And for some strange reason that we have the officers of the court thinking that, no, they're not at risk like that. I wish they had to go out with and deal with some of the people they do and understand that their life is at risk, and certainly for both their families and the general public, becomes a safety issue.
What do you think is going to happen in the courts, Senator? Do you think they will see the light and see that?
Well, I really think that with Assemblyman Hofstadter's look at parole, that whole revamping of what's going to happen, they're just not going to have a choice. We're going to take the legislative action. This is not their jurisdiction, it's ours. It's a legislative situation. We'll take the proper action. I think you're going to see this pass, as well as major reforms in parole and everything else that the people are concerned about.
Okay. We're going to talk a little bit more of that in a moment if we can. We have to take a short break right now. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Gentlemen, when we left, we were talking about the problems and the reasons why it is so important for the probation officers to carry guns. And I also mentioned that I was in Trenton a couple weeks ago for Assemblyman Holzapfel's commission. One of the things that was brought up there is the caseload and how it's just getting worse. You're responsible for more and more numbers every day. Is that ever going to revert to less numbers at some point? Is it what needs to be done there, Stuart?
Exactly. I think that parole officers are finding that to be a problem, and probation officers are as well. Our caseloads in some instances are over 150 for each person in the supervision units, and possibly higher than that in some other areas of the judiciary where probation officers are working, whether it be in child support or in any other area, child support enforcement, I should say, or in the juvenile supervision unit or adult. So that this problem obviously amounts to a situation where we're simply unable to perform our duties properly if we have 100 to 150 offenders to look after on a daily basis.
And concentrating solely on Ocean County now, is the issue of crime, is crime increasing here in Ocean County, and the need for more probation officers to handle those probationers?
I think we're seeing a lot more violent offenders on probation now, both juveniles and adults. I believe that this is probably occurring in a lot of other areas, but in Ocean County, I would imagine that the crime rate certainly isn't tremendously dropping. And again, as I said, with more and more offenders being placed on probation, it's more and more offenders in the Ocean County community that need to be more stringently supervised to protect particularly the elderly in our communities. Those people that simply aren't able, or in areas where there are not a lot of police departments or a lot of policemen in the towns that are able to do this. This is something that we should be doing.
Now, and beside the fact that you have to supervise the probationer, I think someone also mentioned to me that there's a problem because Ocean County doesn't technically have a probation office set up here in Ocean County, and I think they had to travel as far as Atlantic City to do that. Is that correct?
Well, we have an office in Toms River, and we have a satellite office in Manahawkin and Lakewood, although now with the state takeover of the Judiciary of the probation departments, we're not sure how long those offices will continue to exist. But in many cases, we're only at those offices on a maybe once a week basis, so we're not always manning those offices. So.
Another question that always keeps popping up is why the parole board, the parole bureau rather, the parole board, probation, and the ISP are all under different departments in our branches of government. Is that silly to you? Do you think that should be all condensed into one?
Well, I think there's going to be some looking at how that's handled. For example, you know, the parole board has certain mandates, doesn't give them flexibility as to if someone has to stay in prison. They have certain guidelines they have to go to. They want to see some changes in that also. They want to have more flexibility to be able to keep someone in as opposed to what's happening now. And one thing they claimed before is you don't have to guarantee. People think that if you're going to go on parole, they have to guarantee I have a job to go to and have a house to live in, all these things. Those things are gone by the wayside. We've got to go back and start to say we have to be responsible for a person who is leaving prison, that they are going to be successful and not return. And if they're not going to be successful, then we can't just let them out. And we've got to say, you know, get past that idea that we're just going to empty out the prisons to make room for more. That just doesn't work. We have a concern in Ocean County that's certainly a great concern to us. We have a very vulnerable population. The senior population is a vulnerable population, and the answer is we have to make sure that the crime statistics continue not to increase at any rate at all in Ocean County because of that population. The senior population is growing. It's not shrinking in Ocean County. And we don't want to see a situation where we have major problems. I believe that by beefing up both parole officers and probation officers to make sure that those coming in the county on either probation or parole are supervised properly is a safeguard to our senior population. And that will end up being a safeguard statewide. But I think that's part of the key of turning around the situation with repeat offenders, knowing they're being monitored, knowing that someone is checking up on them. You know, if you had the same caseload in DIFAS that these probation officers have, we'd all be offended. We'd say, how can you check on those children, that type of caseload? We're talking about a caseload of 100, 150 offenders. On a monthly basis, how many times can you speak to those 150 offenders? You can't. You can't physically do that. And then when there's a problem, they say to the probation, well, how did this happen? Why did this happen? You've got to give them the wherewithal, not only to protect themselves, but also more of them, to make sure that person coming out of
And then in their defense, they're reprimanded, perhaps with a suspension, like we just seen in the Collins case, for example, right?
Exactly.
Senator Singer, how successful, or how confident, I should say, are you about this when you bring this before the Senate?
I feel good because the attention has been brought from other, unfortunately, some sad cases that we have to do more. And as I said at the very beginning, we have to look for, number one, how to prevent crime, how to deal with that first-time offender that does not get into the system on more serious matters and clamp down on that. And then we have to take a look at the serious offender when they get out of prison and how they're dealt with in the communities. Part of that is, we can talk about it as much as we want, it's got to be, you said, talk about the policeman on the street, it's got to be the probation officer, the parole officer, there on a constant basis. I think the legislature wants to start to make a major change. I think they realize, and the governor realizes, that if we don't make these major changes, we're going to have more serious problems than we've had in the past. This is the best way to do it. Start to give them police powers, and then turn around and find the money. It's not going to be easy, but this is where you have to spend the money on more probation officers and more parole officers in the state.
Stuart, I'm sure that's something you agree with.
Oh, yes, very much so.
I have to say goodbye to you at this time, unfortunately, but I want to thank you for coming in today and enlightening us on an issue like this, which is of such extreme public safety, especially here in Ocean County, since you mentioned our elderly population as well. And hopefully you'll come back in again and tell us more about it.
Thank you very much, and thank the Senator, too, for his assistance for us.
And don't go away. We'll be right back with Senator Singer and some of his agenda for 1996. Stay with us.
and welcome to At Issue. I'm Michelle White, sitting in for Chuck Lampkin. The issue today is one that could be considered an issue of public safety. There are about 1,600 probation officers in New Jersey. Among their many responsibilities, the officers supervise juveniles and adults convicted of attempted murder, rape, and a wide variety of other violent crimes. But these men and women are not permitted to carry weapons, not a gun or even pepper spray. Their only protection is a badge. Members of the Probation Association of New Jersey are looking to change all of that. They are lobbying to have legislation passed that would allow probation officers to carry weapons. Joining me here on At Issue today are the president of the Probation Association of New Jersey, George Christie, and Dan Bergen, who is the legislative representative of PANJ. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. First of all, George, could you explain to us what PANJ is?
Well, PANJ has been around. PANJ is an association. It's been around since 1904 as a professional association, but about 10 years ago, we became a labor organization, and we started representing our people in terms of bargaining, collective bargaining, and grievances and that sort of thing. Today, we represent about 2,500 officers, court employees, professionals, 1,600 probation officers, as you mentioned, and about 600 supervisors.
First of all, before we get into the topic of guns, first, I want you to clarify the difference or the differences between a parole officer and a probation officer. I mean, when I read this, I was like, okay, wait a minute. Let's get it clear.
There's not a lot of difference between a parole officer and a probation officer, actually. Parole officers represent or they supervise criminals after they're released from prison. Probation officers supervise, usually, and in the past it was more so, they supervise criminals before they go to prison. So that's the difference. Oftentimes, they supervise the same person. You'll have a parole officer and a probation officer supervising the very same person out in the field.
First of all, why can't you, as a probation officer, carry a weapon? And I understand parole officers can in the state of New Jersey, correct?
They can.
And you can't?
And we can't. The parole officers couldn't either up until a few years ago. They had the same sort of problem. High caseloads, tremendously high, unworkable caseloads of violent offenders that they had to watch. And what happened was something very bad happened. They had one particular incident that caused a lot of attention, particularly with the legislators. It was a murder of some police officers, and that attention caused the parole officers to get other things, to get more resources funded to them, smaller caseloads, and this law enforcement legislation, it got them brought into the law enforcement community.
Now, Dan, you work on the lobbying side of things, I guess, working with the legislature?
Yes, I do.
For PANJ?
Yes, for PANJ.
What's happening to try and change this way and let probation officers carry guns? What type of legislation is being proposed to make that happen?
Assemblyman Blee and LaFerve from Atlantic County and Senator Singer have sponsored legislation that would provide probation officers with the training and tools they need to effectively deal with the caseloads we're given today. Caseloads are enormously high. We don't have enough resources, and there are many times violent people on these caseloads, and the association believes that we should be given the same rights, duties, and responsibilities that parole officers have, because essentially we do the same job.
What are we seeing more of today, and either one of you can address this, in terms of the type of crimes probation officers are required to supervise, or type of criminals they're to supervise these days?
I have a murderer on my caseload. At one time I had 3 murderers on my caseload. I have people convicted of aggravated assault on law enforcement officers. Almost 50% of the caseload is drug-related. These people, when under the influence, are potentially extremely dangerous and pose a threat both to the community as well as the officers who supervise them. And that's the key. We're looking at it as an issue of public safety here.
Tell me, George, what is a probation officer required to do? Do you have to go into these people's homes, apartments? How do you put yourself in danger? How are you in danger as a probation officer?
I can answer this question. This is a particular problem for us. For example, we represent the probation officers in Newark. Newark is a very tough city. maybe one of the toughest in the country, next to Camden, which is right up there. But these officers have to go out. They don't have cars. They have to use their personal car. Because the Judiciary has not issued them vehicles. One of our officers went out, and they have to go to places that are very difficult. It's not so much the person they're going to supervise as much as when they get out of their vehicle, they're in a neighborhood where they know they don't belong, and the people in the neighborhood know they don't belong.
They know who you are, and they know what you're coming to do, I guess.
And in one particular case, a probation officer, a female probation officer, went to make a home visit in Newark, had a car stolen. When she came out of the building, her car was gone. And we've had probation officers assaulted by strangers on the street, and the probation officers don't know what to do. They're not trained and told what action they're supposed to take in that event, and it becomes so difficult for them because they're afraid to go make the home visits and supervise and be intrusive in the lives of those people they're supervising. It becomes a tough job for them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you really are a danger, I guess. You're going into neighborhoods where, like you said, folks know who you are. Do you carry a badge?
Yes, we carry a badge.
Is it visible for people to see?
We would wear it around a chain on our neck as other law enforcement officers would. But for instance, in Patterson in November, we were shot at in a housing development. We were with the Patterson police doing routine visits, curfew checks, and shots were fired. And we weren't trained to handle such a situation, nor could we even return fire if needed to, if our lives were in danger.
You don't have weapons, nor are the officers being trained.
That's correct.
To use them, and how, I guess, in self-defense.
There's no statewide standards here. It varies from county to county, but the ultimate goal is to get everybody uniform throughout the state, have an approved police training course for all enforcement duties that are required of us.
We're going to talk more about that. We're going to take a short commercial break, but when At Issue continues, we'll continue this discussion about probation officers, self-defense, and public safety. So stay with us. Welcome back to At Issue. The issue today, probation officers around the state routinely keep tabs on dangerous criminals, and they can sometimes find themselves in precarious situations. However, they are not permitted to carry weapons to defend themselves, not a gun, not mace, nothing at all. In fact, even if they see someone committing a crime, they have absolutely no authority to take someone into custody, even though they are employees of the courts. Discussing that issue today is George Christie and Dan Bergen. They are with the Probation Association of New Jersey. And I think a lot of people might find that surprising, that you have no authority to take someone in, even though you are an employee of the court. You can't carry a weapon, not even mace. To me, that is really strange because you're dealing with dangerous criminals. And I didn't realize to the degree of the criminals that you're dealing with. You said murders, you have murders you deal with, rapists, people who have committed heinous crimes. How would carrying a gun make you feel safer? I'm playing devil's advocate here because some people are strictly and solely against it, and you've dealt with them, each of you has. But on the other hand, you've dealt with people who are advocates of you carrying weapons. But how would it make you feel safer?
Well, first of all, I don't believe this bill, this legislation, is a gun bill. It's sort of portrayed that way. It's a law enforcement bill, and it provides training and the tools to perform your duties. That may include carrying a gun. I would never expect probation officers to go out and be shooting people all day long. I think that having that gun allows you the ability to just feel comfortable enough and trained well enough to be able to perform your duties in some high-risk areas. And a lot of times the clients that you're supervising live in high-risk areas, and it's important for you to feel like you can do that job.
Now, Dan, you talked about training. Is training a part of the bill?
Yes, it would provide complete law enforcement training approved by the Police Training Commission and give us the training that all other law enforcement officers in the state have.
And this would be concealed weapons you're asking, or what?
Well, we really haven't gotten that far. We'd like parole officers have a concealed weapon, I suppose. It's on their belt. But they also have clothing that's marked that says who they are.
And you don't?
Not at all.
You dress like this? I mean, suits or what have you?
Well, when I'm in the courthouse, I am, but in the field, of course, I'd be in street clothes.
Regular clothing and in your own car?
Not in my case, in my own car.
Right, but generally, probation officers?
Probation officers in many counties have to drive their own vehicle.
Mm-hmm. Have you been in any precarious situations, in any sticky situations in each of your careers as probation officers, where you think that you would have felt better if you may have had that weapon next to you?
Oh, I believe we have had several in my circumstance. I've had a guy report with a knife in his jacket. I didn't know that, and someone told me that there was a warrant out for him. They just told me to keep him occupied for a while. Mm-hmm. Never telling me that there was a warrant. Just keep talking to him. And they finally called the police. It seemed like forever, and the police came in and they grabbed the man and searched him and found this knife, but about this long, by the way. But that, to me, that was very alarming, because I should have been able to do something, or the probation officer in the next room who told me to talk to him should have been able to do something.
Absolutely. Do they provide you with cell phones? Do you have a radio?
In my county, we're given cell phones and radios. For instance, to amplify what George was saying, a probationer under my supervision committed a murder approximately 12 months ago, and during the course of his apprehension by the police, he aimed his weapon at the two police officers who were going to arrest him. Luckily, the gun jammed twice. He was, in addition to being charged with the murder, he was charged with attempted murder of the two police officers. Ironically, in my county, we make arrests. I was going to arrest that probationer in an unrelated incident just hours after that murder occurred. Now, what if I had gone out to apprehend this probationer with my fellow officers unarmed, and this man had an automatic weapon at the time?
We don't want to think about that.
We don't want to think about it. It's a public safety issue. What are we going to say to the family of the first probation officer who's murdered?
That's right. That's right. Any statistics, any numbers, fatalities, or anything like that in this state or nationwide? Do you have any figures?
This state doesn't keep a lot of good records on the number of injuries of probation officers, but there have been a number of probation officers assaulted and attacked by dogs and threatened. I know one probation officer, a parent of a child that he was supervising, tried to hire someone to blow up his car because they were angry with him for violation of probation. It's that sort of thing. We've had a number of those kinds of things, threats, physical assaults. No one's been killed in New Jersey.
Luckily.
Luckily for us, but nationally they have been.
So
nationally, I believe there were 15 murders recently.
15 murders?
15 murders.
Nationwide?
Of parole or probation officers.
And many rapes and
numerous assaults. Unfortunately, I don't have the encyclopedic recall anymore. But
right, but that's ballpark of what it is. Some people may just be tuning in, thinking that probation officers already had, the clearance to carry a weapon. You don't. And that's why we're here today.
That's right.
The legislation that is proposed, it will be voted upon this coming session.
It's in the hopper right now. We don't have any specific
right, it's
dates.
Still being drawn up.
No, it's drafted.
It's drafted?
It's passed unanimously from the Senate last May, and it will be considered by the Assembly this session.
Fantastic. Well, once again, we're going to take a short commercial break. When we return, we'll wrap up our discussion here, so please stay with us. Welcome back to At Issue. Once again, our topic today is this. Probation officers, the people who monitor violent criminals throughout the state, are not allowed to carry weapons, even though their job sometimes takes them to places where it's very dangerous and dangerous situations. Here to explain why they think that should change are George Christie, president of the Probation Association of New Jersey, and Dan Bergen. Dan is the legislative representative of PANJ. George, how have, and Dan, How have the types of criminals that you're monitoring or supervising changed as opposed to 20 years ago? What are the differences today?
Well, I supervised criminals 20 years ago on probation. Dan's came a little after me, but years ago they were not quite as dangerous. They were drug offenders who are, not to say that they can't be dangerous, but more of the drug offender type people, petty thefts, and that sort of thing. Today, with the jails being overcrowded and the plea bargains, and the attention given to domestic violence and the sex offenses, all these people have been brought onto the probation ranks, and they're a difficult group to watch, and it's almost impossible when your caseloads are 200, 300, 400 per officer.
Now you're saying murderers. What surprises me is that the murderers aren't being put in jail, that the judge has, I guess, the autonomy, of course, to say, hey, you're going to go on probation, and that person has committed a murder. And you're dealing with these people today, and of course you are, but 20 years ago was a little different, more lightweight crimes. But today, what you have out there, Dan, more heinous, like he was saying.
I'll give you an example of that. I know of a parolee who assaulted his parole officer. The parole officer filed a charge of aggravated assault against the parolee. The parolee was convicted of the aggravated assault. And the parolee was sentenced to probation. Now, parole officers are armed, and probation officers are not. So what are the chances that this parolee/probationer is going to assault his probation officer?
Maybe he thought the probation officer would have better luck?
Perhaps.
I don't know.
I mean, I don't know. So a weapon. Having one would make you feel more secure in the field?
With the combined with the training.
The training is the key thing, and how to handle yourself in dangerous situations, self-defense issues, how to be trained in terms of diffusing situations, in terms of dealing with probationers on a rational basis rather than a confrontational basis.
You just don't want the right to just carry a weapon.
No, that's not what it's all about.
You're not asking just for that.
That's right. You need to know how to act and how to conduct yourself in the field, and it should be an automatic kind of movement.
Trenton's expanded our role. They want us more intrusively in the community, and I think the community demands it as well, because there are probationers all over this state, and most people don't know who they are. If we're to properly monitor them, we need to be trained in field tactics and issues.
Self-defense.
Self-defense. And the same training that law enforcement officers get.
And there are some 120 folks on probation, 120,000 people on probation throughout the state?
That's about right, and about 20,000 juveniles. And about 20,000 active bench warrants right now. And these are bench warrants issued, and people aren't being picked up because the police and the sheriff's departments don't have time to do that sort of thing. They get a low priority on probation bench warrants.
Yeah, I said that. I just want to give people an idea of how many folks are on probation out there. Tell me about some of the folks who are backing you. I think you have some big names, some big people in New Jersey backing legislation.
Well, Senator Singer is, of course, the sponsor of the bill, along with Assemblyman Blee and LaFerve. We also secured the support of the Sheriff of Passaic County, Edwin Engelhardt, who has written letters and lobbied for this bill on our behalf.
And
Senator McGreevey.
Senator McGreevey, of course.
And they've written letters on your behalf, and
that's correct.
Staunch supporters of Pange.
That's
Fantastic.
correct.
So again, you want the right to carry weapons, not just to strike back, but for public safety purposes, not just to be reckless at all.
Yeah, I think the public.
Let's get that misnomer out of the way.
That's right. I think the public expects that we carry weapons.
Yeah, I thought you did.
Our legislators believe that we do, and I'm sure that the public thinks we do also, and it's probably the appropriate thing to do.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. We are out of time. And again, I'd like to thank my guests, George Christie and Dan Bergen of Pange. I'm Michelle White, sitting in for Chuck Lampkin. Thanks for watching at Issue. Hope you can join us next time. Until then, take care.
Since June of 1999.
Equal or approximate pay with maybe parole officers and federal probation officers, at least somewhere in the same footing. Well, our starting salary is $29, and I believe the starting salary for a parole officer is $39. So we'd like to increase that a little bit.
Dan Stiles, the vice president of Local 106, says probation officers are overwhelmed with caseloads that exceed 150 offenders. He says they'd like to see the numbers drop down to about 50 or 60 offenders.
Just for an instance, there's 25,000 people or criminals who are presently out on a bench warrant, or they haven't appeared in court, or a violation of probation was filed, and the court doesn't know where they are. You know, those people are posing a risk to the community.
Probation officers handle a variety of different cases. They supervise and enforce court orders, oversee at least 15,000 child support cases in the county, monitor juveniles, make sure offenders are following through on substance abuse treatment, and more.
GPU Energy has assured Ocean County residents that its
officers around the state say after 2 years without a contract, they're overworked and underpaid.
News 12 New Jersey's Tom Fitzgerald reports they took to the streets today to tell their story.
Try and help them, and at the same time, we're not getting that much help ourselves.
Andrew Gertellis says he got into probation work because he thought he could help get criminals on the right track. But now Gertellis says he's getting railroaded.
It makes just my job feel a little bit not appreciated.
At every county courthouse around New Jersey, there were scenes like this one. Probation officers protesting the fact they've been without a contract for 2 years.
It's hard to keep working and doing your job knowing that you don't have support from the people who pay you.
Parole officers have been without a contract since back of June in 1999, which has set up a situation, they say, which has lowered morale at the same time that their workload is higher than ever.
Public safety is the main issue.
Stuart Martinson is a spokesperson for the union representing probation officers. He tells News 12 New Jersey the ongoing negotiations have left officers doing a tough job in a professional limbo.
A lot of it has to do with going out in the evenings, weekends, into the field, into sometimes very bad areas where police don't want to go, and having to check on offenders.
For now, folks here say they will continue to earn their pay, even if they aren't exactly sure what that pay will be. In Toms River, Tom Fitzgerald, News 12, New Jersey.
Members say the workload is increasing. A recent study by the Star-Ledger shows that people on probation in New Jersey are arrested 23,000 times a year. That averages to one probation arrest every 22 minutes.
The big rigs better find.
And turning to news from back home, probation officers in New Jersey want guns and the power to arrest lawbreakers. Their state union, the Probation Association of New Jersey, says that the 150,000 people on probation in the state have gotten increasingly more dangerous over the years.
We've been, for the past several years, we've been trying to show the judiciary in this state that probation officers are in danger when they perform their duties. Increasingly more in danger as the years have gone on.
The state judiciary, court administrators, judges are vehemently opposed to having probation officers carry firearms, arresting or detaining probationers, or even enforcing criminal law, because they see that the duties of a probation officer are to act as an arm of the court to carry out orders. Therefore, they believe that probation officers must remain totally impartial to fulfill the judicial support roles they have, and that a law delegating law enforcement duties and powers to probation officers will threaten their neutrality by allying the officers with police, creating a conflict of interest for probation officers as judiciary employees.
I don't see the logic behind that. Now, if we look at the federal agencies, the federal judiciary in New Jersey considers probation, particularly in New Jersey, hazardous duty. Federal probation officers who work in this state get paid extra money to work in this state. And federal judges in this state voted to give their officers, allow them to carry weapons to protect themselves.
But the state judiciary says protection is not an issue. According to numbers provided by the Probation Association of New Jersey, there have been 10 reports of physical threats against probation officers, 1 reported theft, 2 occasions where a crime was observed by a probation officer, and 5 probation officers have been assaulted with minor injuries resulting. There were 19 situations that caused anxiety, and in a very singular case, an unknown person fired on a probation officer in Patterson, and in Newark, a probation officer was warned by local police not to go into an area without a weapon that was blocked off because of criminal activity. In the 96-year history of the state's probation services, no probation officer has ever been killed in a line of duty. The state's judiciary points out that there has been few incidents of violence against probation officers, and that arming the officers and requiring that they perform law enforcement duties will increase, not decrease, the chance that probation officers could be subjected to violent acts.
Is that their response that one of our officers has to be killed or raped, and then they'll sign on to it? I don't want to wait for that day. I want our officers to be able to do their job and do it properly. I want them to be able to go out and feel like they're safe enough and they're trained well enough to do that job. And I think the public expects that.
Well, if you've seen the movie The
Watching News 12 New Jersey, as local news gets.
Wanted lady indeed. A new law takes effect today. Probation officers are now allowed to carry guns. The officers say they need those weapons to protect themselves. But News 12 New Jersey's Tom Fitzgerald reports some say it's a move that misses the mark.
It's a law that's right on target, according to Probation Association of New Jersey President George Christie.
I'm very surprised that no one's been killed, but that day is coming.
Christie's group pushed to give probation officers guns, citing 10 attacks against officers in the past 6 months. Most recently, 2 officers threatened in Asbury Park.
A young man came running out at them with and pulled a large knife about this big out of his waistband, and of course they jumped in their automobile and sped away.
Giving someone the right to carry is something that's very serious.
State Senator Robert Singer says he was skeptical about arming probation officers, but changed his mind and then sponsored the law.
The type of person coming to probation today is in many cases far more violent than they were 25, 30 years ago, and the role of the probation officer has changed.
But not everybody thinks arming probation officers is a good idea. In fact, Ceasefire New Jersey, one of the state's largest anti-gun groups, says arming probation officers sends the wrong message to criminals, and in the end could wind up targeting the officers themselves.
More guns means more danger.
Former Ocean County Prosecutor Daniel Carluccio is co-chair of Ceasefire. He says guns cloud probation officers' role in the justice system.
I can't understand what justification there is for it. Probation officers have all of the imprimatur of the law and the courts. I guess the next step will be that we'll want to have our judges armed under the robes.
But with the law in effect, New Jersey probation officers are now armed with more than just strong words. In Toms River, Tom Fitzgerald, News 12, New Jersey.
Some questions are still unsettled. Who's going to pay for the guns, and who will be in charge of training?
Atlantic City.
New Jersey's court system is going to court to try to overturn a law that gives certain probation officers the right to carry a firearm. Probation officers are employees of the court system. Their union and other law enforcement unions are outraged that the judiciary would try to challenge a law designed to protect its own public safety workers. Michael Aaron reports.
Joseph Leake and Robert Murray are probation officers. The men they monitor may have committed robbery or sexual assault. They say they're concerned about their safety. Last fall, the legislature passed a bill creating a special force of 200 probation officers authorized for firearms training and possession. There are 1,800 probation officers overall. Right now, in a dangerous situation, they have to call in the police. The new law would give the special force the right to make arrests. But Chief Justice Deborah Poritz and Judge Richard Williams, the head of the Administrative Office of the Courts, say that law violates the separation of powers. You cannot have law enforcement officers within the judiciary accountable to the supervision of the executive branch and the Attorney General, Williams says.
We are here today at a truly disappointing period in our long relationship with the state judiciary.
The Probation Association says its men are told to run away from dangerous confrontations because they can't make arrests and are not trained or armed to defend themselves.
I find it ironic that as judges sit in courtrooms protected by armed sheriff's officers, that probation officers are being sent to enforce court orders with no weapons, no self-defense training, and no support from our employer.
Some other states and the federal government arm their probation officers, argued several law enforcement union leaders.
Tying the hands of qualified public safety officials does not seem to be an appropriate policy for our judiciary.
The Judiciary has filed suit in state court in Mercer County to block the new law, which has not yet gone into effect. Republican Assembly leader Paul DiGaetano takes strong exception to that.
And I said the other day, this is the height of hypocrisy, that the courts should actually file a lawsuit, which ultimately they might have to hear. Could you imagine that they would lose? Why not just tell us what the decision is now and save a lot of time and money?
While Chief Justice Porras backs the filing of the suit, the other 6 justices have not participated in the decision. If the case were to reach the Supreme Court, Porras would recuse herself, say court officials. Probation officers Leake and Murray work in the Mercer County Courthouse, the same building where the Judiciary's lawsuit has been assigned to Superior Court Judge Linda Feinberg.